Welcome everyone to a video lecture on Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. The more I read the Baudrillard, the more I think of him really as a traditionalist. I say a bit more on that in a second. There is, of course, Baudrillard has been made famous by this film, The Matrix, which is a complete corruption of what Baudrillard wanted to say with his work on Simulacra and Simulation. Baudrillard despised the Matrix films, terrible and flawed as they are, for their ideological warfare against the real and utmost corruption of the remnants of metaphysics. He was appalled by Matrix because it was a celebration of the simulacrum. I mean, and they're so obviously, they're so obviously a rehashing of Christianity for the modern age that it's almost bizarre to see that, people watch these films and say, "Oh, have you made Matrix? The oracle is divine," and yeah, it's a film. They want to draw you into the diabolical simulacrum. It is a simulacrum of a simulacrum, that film, and it is done, I think, with the purpose to exacerbate and accelerate the power grab of the simulacrum. To have a simulacrum of a simulacrum that you can always refer to within itself without ever trying to find back to the origin. Which is also why they had to make a fourth film at this time, which is quite significant, I think. So, what these films do is that they claim that there's something behind reality, something hitherto hidden and concealed, which is exactly how the simulacrum must operate, which, by the way, has nothing to do with metaphysics. The simulacrum, in fact, wants to destroy any and all access to the origin, by distorting our relationship with the real and by insinuating that there is always something suspicious lurking behind the real and that we are powerless on top of it. So the hyperreal for Baudrillard is the replacement of the real with the simulation. Baudrillard explicitly speaks of the collapse of metaphysics and of the collapse of abstraction even. Without the real, there can be no abstraction. This is on the first page of the book. He writes, here's a quote, "It is all of metaphysics that is lost." And I don't think that this is triumphant. I think that Baudrillard, given that I think he's a traditionalist, and he wanted to get published, obviously, so he went another route, but he understands the terrifying consequences of what's coming from America to Europe. It's the destruction of metaphysics in all its categories and determinations. The loss of metaphysics is a peculiar fate that is European and must be accepted, I think, as our destiny. It cannot be resolved or even solved by anyone else. We have to carry this burden and to ensure that the world does not disappear with this loss of metaphysics, this collapse into utter contingency. Baudrillard sends a clear and explicit warning, I think, but to us he sends it, to the mind of Europe. And it is this mind which has to generate from its cosmic wellspring a new access to its tradition, so that the simulators, the professional simulacra manufacturers, lose, who are at this point nothing short of saying, as you know, that the human being is obsolete. It's diabolical. Baudrillard, I said before, is a traditionalist. A firmly French-European, continental, occidental traditionalist. A thinker who sees the colonizing effects of the hypermedia and how that corrupts Europe at its core. All his examples of the book are from American culture, TV, and film. There are two further misunderstandings about Baudrillard. First, Baudrillard does not argue that the map becomes the territory. These are the old ways of abstraction. There's a beauty in it, he even says. The pleasures of metaphysical abstraction. Simulation and simulacra are something other entirely, as we shall see. So it's not the map being configured as a territory, but it's the computer model that comes before. And that then all of the world has to adhere to that model. And if it doesn't, the world disappears behind the computer model. That never happened with map and territory. Even though Baudrillard, this is the second misunderstanding, even though he argues that, for example, the war in Vietnam or the first Gulf War are simulacra, he doesn't say that men don't die in them. And he doesn't say that no one suffers. He says they do suffer and they do die. This is real. Instead, and this is much more profound what he says, is that war itself is no more because there are no more real adversaries. There is no more a, quote, reality of antagonistic causes, no seriousness of war, but instead all has collapsed into a one-sided oneness. That is why the war is a simulacrum. Now look at what he says here, page 2. The real is, quote, real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control, and it can be reproduced an indefinite number of times from these. All becomes operational, as he says. Now, I have a point perhaps briefly on the hyperreal. Now, Baudrillard writes in French, and he writes at the edge of metaphysics or at the collapse of it. And as we can see also with thinkers like Descartes, hundreds of years before, 250 years before Baudrillard, there's something in the French and in the Latin language that makes itself prone to reification to a certain degree. There's no fault of the language. It's just simply stating a fact, right? Which at the same time allows for its incredible precision and the diagnosis of the time which we have to thank the French thinkers for. But it is not as, for example, as spatial, temporal, as, for example, ancient Greek or German. So the notion of hyperreal, and you very often hear which with French thinkers, hypersensible, etc. This notion of hyper, to me, indicates something. This is way going beyond Baudrillard, but that the imagination tries to leap beyond what it can say. And as it is at the very cusp of what it can say, it introduces something like in a post-truth, or what was the other thing? The post-modern, etc., post-structural, is all the post, or hyper. Whereas here, speculative thinking should come in. Of course, Baudrillard would say speculative thinking is no longer possible, but I beg to differ. Anyways, back to him. What Baudrillard sees as the threat in the moment of the hyperreal, of the simulacrum and the simulation, is that the real doesn't produce itself. And that is a very real threat that already Hegel sees with Kant's philosophy, that there is no productivity of itself in the things or in nature, but that in fact, nature is just a product. And that it is produced, but there's no productivity in and of itself. And here's a very interesting quote that Baudrillard brings from Lettré, which perhaps says something about our time, given that I'm recording this in 2022. Quote, "Whoever fakes an illness can simply stay in bed and make everyone believe he is ill. Whoever simulates an illness produces in himself some of the symptoms. The pretense, the fakeness, leaves intact," says Baudrillard, "the principle of reality." That's not distorted. Whereas the simulation destroys the difference between real and fake. The principle of reality is destroyed in the simulation, because some of the symptoms are produced when you simulate an illness, which is why some diseases have a plethora of symptoms. All kinds of symptoms are all of a sudden grouped together into one big abstraction, no, not abstraction, of course, a real disease, a real simulation of a disease, as it were, and blurring all the determinations that made medicine possible in the first place. For Baudrillard, medicine is no longer possible. It's collapsed. It's at this point, it's an operation that produces simulacra of health, but cannot ever be what medicine is in its traditional, fundamental sense that it has. It is lost. Certainty disappears. He says explicitly, Cartesian certainty disappears. This is why Baudrillard is here in this series of lectures on French philosophy. And the simulacrum is not unreal. Again, the wars did happen. It is not false and it's not fake, but it is not real either. So it's not unreal. It's neither unreal nor real. It is hyperreal, the simulacrum is, insofar as it is concerned with copies without an original. The simulacrum shows that there has never been an original. And this is where I think Baudrillard goes very far. It's not entirely clear to me what he's trying to say. Is he trying to say that what we are experiencing now is what the world has always been? It's always just been a simulacrum. There's never been origin, or it's now become so corrupt that there is no more access to original. But we could maybe take it even a bit further and say that even if the beginning, the origin of all origins, were a simulacrum, an origin without origin, then that wouldn't mean that this couldn't be referential to what follows after it. So, of course, for Baudrillard, God is a simulacrum. And after the death of God, as he says, that's the advent of religion. That's when religion really starts, is when God dies. But I think there are very clear tendencies in Baudrillard. So he points to Plato and the primordial images, etc. But still, even though he does seem to say that it's always just been a simulacrum and it's just now coming to the fore through technology, I don't think that this is really where he's going. I think that what he's really trying to say, and this is maybe also where he lacks some of the ways of thinking. So when he thinks that Plato is just speaks of primordial images, well, Plato really doesn't. The highest form of Plato is found in the Parmenides dialogue, where it's a principal logical thinking of the idei and of the one and the many. By the way, the ideas in Plato, they're not images. They're not things or entities or any of this. They're principles. And a thinking that fails to think in terms of principles will not be able to see this. But on the other note then, though, of course, we could say, there are these moments, and there is a lecture on my channel on this, that we can read Plato and saying that this could be a simulation-like scenario, the cosmos. And there are these moments in Plato where this comes through. So what we can see then, though, with Baudrillard is that it's not just modern technology that does this, but maybe that exacerbates this. This is, however, we could say always already also one of the threats that is there in reality itself, to that there can be simulations can be generated, and from this simulacra can be generated. That this is not just now exacerbated by the technique of our time. For Baudrillard, science itself has become an operation of controlling through simulations and simulacra, dissolving beings. So, and what he sees at the heart of our, he gives this example of the mummy of Ramses II. He says, mummies don't rot from worms. They die from being transplanted from a slow order of the symbolic, master over putrefaction and death, to an order, which he says is ours, of history, science, and museums, our order which no longer masters anything, which only knows how to condemn what preceded it to decay in death and subsequently to try to revive it with science. Irreparable violence toward all secrets. The violence of a civilization without secrets, hatred of a whole civilization for its own foundation. So he says that our civilization is one which hates secrets. Hence, it must dissolve everything. All becomes a problem which is to be dissolved. There's no secret, no eros, no concealment, no mysterium left. continues to say about Disneyland that Disneyland is a perfect model of all entangled orders of simulacra. It is first of all a play of illusions and phantasms. And of course, this is Disneyland in LA, and I wonder what he did say about Disneyland in Paris. It opened a bit later, and why it was opened in Paris. And what Baudrillard, I think, admits also is that even the most unoriginal, anti-original simulacrum still is parasitical on some remnant of the real. Take the example of Disneyland. The castle of Disneyland is a copy of one of the castles, Neuschwanstein in that case, built by König Ludwig II of Bavaria. Now, of course, that castle, you can say, is itself already somewhat of a fantasy, a completely useless castle that is born from the fancies of one man who bankrupted his state for it, his treasury for it, for his fantasies. But still, what are the stories that Disney tells? Well, it's German fairy tales. It's the fairy tales that the brothers Grimm collected from German peasants. Cinderella, Snow White, or however they're translated into English, these are German fairy tales that Disney turns into Coca-Cola bubblegum and re-exports to the world as a simulacrum. Let me find the quote here on simulacrum. That is why today this material production is that of the hyperreal itself. It retains all features, the whole discourse of traditional production, but it is no longer anything but its scaled down refraction. Thus hyperrealists fix a real from which all meaning and charm, all depth and energy of representation have vanished in hallucinatory resemblance. This is exactly what Disney films are. They're hallucinatory. A hallucinatory resemblance. There's no signifier, there's no connection anymore to the story itself. It becomes, at best, you could say, kitsch. Thus, everywhere he continues, the hyper-realism of simulation is translated by the hallucinatory resemblance of the real to itself. So it is parasitical, I read this as saying. It's parasitical on the real, on the genuine, on the organic, on that which has grown authentically. And without it, the simulacrum collapses. There is no simulacrum, there's no computer simulation, none of it, without the real. But of course, the real disappears in these parasitical reductions of it. Hence also talk of enlightenment values, of course, critiques of postmodernists supposedly for the sake of truth, can be nothing but simulacra. And so maybe a bit more on simulation and what Baudrillard sees our time as. So he says, if one envisions the entire cycle of any act or event in a system where linear continuity and dialectical polarity no longer exist, this comes back to the adversariety in the wars, in a field unhinged by simulation, all determination evaporates. Every act is terminated at the end of the cycle, having benefited everyone and having been scattered in all directions. All determinations, he says, is destroyed. But still there is a dialectic. But now so he says there is no dialectic. I would say there is one, which is now used, however, in such an external manner as a steering mechanism. And this is exactly also Baudrillard's point. He just says it's not a genuine dialectic anymore. But again, here we have a so-called postmodern writer who says that all determination is destroyed, and he doesn't celebrate this. I think he wants to articulate a way out. But I think Baudrillard lacks, unfortunately, some of the well, some of the training in higher logic that you would require to be able to articulate those ways out. But he can point us in his extremely precise diagnosis to exactly what it is that the hyperreal, the simulacrum, is trying to achieve and how it achieves it. And of course, you know, when they made the Matrix films, they wanted Baudrillard to play a role in one of the films. I think is the Oracle, and he refused, of course. I mean, but you see how the simulacrum works, right? It sees an attack on it and notices this attack and wants to pull you in, give you a role, make you famous, make you the Oracle. Baudrillard, a man of character, of backbone, said, "No merci. No thank you, Mr. The media are not viral," he says. They're not infectual. Instead, one must think of, quote, the media as if they were in outer orbit, a kind of genetic code that directs the mutation of the real into the hyperreal, just as the other micromolecular code controls the passage from a representative sphere of meaning to the genetic one of the programmed signal. And it's the whole traditional world of causality that is in question. So again, this is a quote from Baudrillard, it is the whole traditional world of causality that is in question. Who would say this if not someone who is a traditionalist at the very cusp of what tradition can say and diagnoses his time with absolute precision as only a Frenchman can, and also with the gusto and the heart that is lacking so often today, and at the same time taking there's absolutely no reactionary impulse or any of the sort. Just someone firmly seeing, diagnosing the time and what the colonizing effects are that Europe has to deal with and where they come from. And of course, at the same time, as I said before, as he's tempted to become part of it, he refuses. The hyperreal simulacrum power distorts the real. It uses it for its means, but must at all costs prohibit the real ever to enter again. And this is achieved, as Baudrillard says, by continuous crises, threats of extinction and annihilation, he says, that are never real but always hallucinatory. So the real must never enter. The hyperreal simulacrum power distorts the real, is parasitical on it. But something genuinely real must never enter. And this is done by having continuous repetitive crises and threats of extinction. Can you think of any? And annihilation. Can you think of any threats that are always hurling around? You know, sometimes they're very small. Usually, funnily enough, they're always very small and always invisible, aren't they? While the real is thereby barred from entering. And it's perfected this system, the simulacrum has. It has perfected it. But one way of saying no to it is, as Baudrillard himself did, this great French gentleman, is by saying no when the offer comes. Here's a quote from him. Many other events, he says, the oil crisis never started, never existed, except as artifacts of history, catastrophes and crises destined to maintain a historical investment under hypnosis. Can you think of any other crises that are mentioned all the time? I can think of a few, which perhaps never started and never existed. And they're so wonderfully blurry and, let's just say, abstract, that any event that occurs already factors into this simulated simulacrum. But the real, when the real breaks through and it doesn't fit in with the narrative of the simulacrum, it falls out of it. So there are ways of articulating ways out, and it starts with having a backbone. Thank you very much.